America is playing a strange game in the Middle East. After long-standing Iran-related sanctions were lifted, Washington immediately imposed new sanctions because of Iran's defensive missile program, a move interpreted by Tehran as propaganda and harassment. Yet at the same time, the US is still the biggest seller of advanced weapons to Saudi Arabia, its satellite states, and extremist militants in the region. Victims have included Palestinians, Yemenis and Syrians, and almost exclusively civilians. The US imposed the sanctions following a recent ballistic missile test, just as Tehran and world powers began implementation of the July nuclear deal, whose key purpose was the very removal of all embargoes against Iran. Iran's top deputy commander says that as the US is intensifying its threats against Iran, Iran has no option other than boosting its defense capabilities. President Rouhani says this will help, not threaten, regional stability, but America seems intent on carrying on with its sanctions strategy. What sanctions should be imposed on the US, the UK and France for supplying arms in the Middle East? What should be done to disarm Israel? And which countries present the greater threat to world peace? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. Now, there's been a huge surge of dangerous and sophisticated weapons supplied to undemocratic regimes in the Persian Gulf, particularly by the US. How does this make you feel? That's what we asked the American public.
Well, I think in any peacekeeping situation, you may have to supply weapons because you're fighting people who have weapons as well. I think it's probably an equal division of tactics and warfare, and I would think that whatever people decide is important enough to do, I really don't have any opinion downgrading that situation.
It's funny, I was just thinking about our government and how it doesn't really speak for me. And I feel really outside of it and try not to get involved in politics as much as possible.
I think that it's wrong for any government, I mean, in this case, the United States, but any government in particular, to supply weapons, basically, to regimes that, whether they're democratically elected or they're against democratically elected governments or not, for whatever reason. I just don't think it's the best thing to do in like the other countries' interest. It might be in America's interest, it might be the best thing to do, but perhaps the interest of America would be very short term, as opposed to trying to maintain stability in the countries that in the Persian Gulf, like you said.
Doesn't sound good, but I don't know too much about the issue. I haven't really read up on it too much.
I don't support it. I guess sometimes conflicting political interests, depending on what conflict we're interested in, what's going on, we tend to give weapons to people that we later regret giving them to, and we don't seem to have learned from those mistakes yet.
Oh, I really don't know how to answer that.
How do our experts feel about the vast increase in the supply of highly advanced weapons by America and others to undemocratic Persian Gulf regimes?
Well, obviously we are in the throes of a regional arms race where many powers, the Russians, the Americans, the Turks, the Saudis, are all intervening in different parts of the Middle East and making it much more unstable than it was even under the old Arab dictators, and it was unstable enough then. So I think it makes most people feel fearful that the conflicts that are already taking place may explode into a regional war which will suck in the major powers, and that's a very dangerous and frightening prospect.
Of course, even democratic regimes, Western democratic regimes, have a bad record in matters like aggression and invading foreign countries. So we've seen Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and so on. But specifically, thinking about the regimes in question, first of all, the United States, of course, you could argue we're having here merchants of death, or certainly merchants of menace. who are, by the sale of weapons to regimes like Saudi Arabia, are actually endangering world peace, because the Saudi regime cannot be counted on not to use those weapons in a responsible way, especially when the Saudi regime is so worried about its self-preservation. So I do feel, I've also lived in the Middle East during the first Gulf War, and so I do know that all this makes you feel very, very worried, and not just for me, but for the people at large.
Regimes which are also safe havens for Al-Qaeda are hostile to Iran, yet the US is trying to hinder Iran's right of self-defense with new sanctions on its missile defense program. Is this an act of war by the US or just plain madness? We put that question to the public.
I don't necessarily I think it's an act of war. It's an act of self-interest on behalf of the United States, which I'm hesitant to call it an act of war just now, or madness. I mean, just as it's playing out. So, I mean, it definitely is a little madness on behalf of the United States, but I wouldn't go as far as calling it an act of war.
I would say it's probably an act of war.
It's madness, in my opinion. The whole situation is very interesting. I personally don't agree with the current decisions to go ahead and have the Iranian nuclear deal. It's going to bring, in my opinion, future problems, unwanted problems and unnecessary problems that I don't feel we need to have, and we have other issues that we need to solve as a country already. So that's why I think it's a bring madness.
It's neither, but it's totally bizarre that we don't realize that Iran is our #1 ally in that area in defeating ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
I don't really know. I think that the U.S.'s relationship with Saudi Arabia sort of conflicts anything that it wants to do with Iran because of their inherent sort of disagreements. And especially with the recent sort of scaling of tensions between the two countries, I think it'll be interesting if we scale down our relationship with Saudi Arabia, if we sort of bond closer to Iran or not, or which side we sort of choose to be on, since right now we're sort of trying to be on both, and that can't last very long.
What's the logic behind America's attempts to prevent Iran from being able to defend itself against Al-Qaeda strongholds? Or is it really just an act of political insanity? Here's the expert judgment on the matter.
No, it's not an act of war, but it does tell you about the cynical nature of the United States' diplomacy in the region. Actually, it's not, of course, universally hostile to Iran. It wants Iran to help stabilize the situation in Iraq. So it will do what it's always done. It will use whichever power is going to be as compliant as possible with the United States in any given set of circumstances. Sometimes, mainly, that's been Saudi Arabia. For certain purposes, it will be Iran. Sometimes it's Turkey, sometimes it's not Turkey. This just tells you about the calculations that the Americans are making. They have, as they've often said, no eternal allies and no eternal enemies.
Well, I would say it's an act of stupidity, first of all, stupidity, because really the United States have just reached an agreement to lift Iran economic sanctions on Iran. So quite clearly, the Secretary of State Kerry does not regard Iran as being a threat to US security. But here, I'm afraid, I must draw attention to the Zionist lobby of the United States, which is really obsessed with Iran, which is always constantly try to carry out an insane propaganda campaign against Iran and try to target Iran and make Iran feel as if Iran was threatening anybody. And I think that there is a right of self-defense, which is actually enshrined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Every country has the right to defend itself, and Iran is surrounded by US military bases. The Fifth Fleet, US Fifth Fleet, has a huge headquarters in Bahrain, and there are US military bases. It's like an iron ring circling all Iran, whereas Iran has no bases anywhere. So the whole thing is quite clearly a strategy of menace.
Iran has not attacked another country in over 100 years, whereas the US, Israel and Saudi Arabia together have attacked many. Based on record, who is the greater threat to world peace? Here's the public's view.
Well, I think everyone has to work together. And so, you know, that's my problem, is that all governments seem to be corrupt and refuse to look at the bigger picture, that we're all in this together.
I don't think it's Iran, but I also don't think it's like Saudi Arabia or Israel or any of those countries. I'm just hesitant to place blame.
I don't think either one is necessarily a threat to world peace, you know.
Oh, I think it's a tough question to answer. It's probably the country that's supplying more weapons and probably who has the intentions of causing harm instead of the intentions of causing peace or bringing about peace. So I'm not really certain. I'm kind of on the fence about a lot of these things.
The U.S. That's all I'm saying.
Given the frequent military attacks which have been ordered by the politicians in Paris, Washington and Tel Aviv, and Iran's comparative non-aggression, which country or countries are truly the bigger threat to peace? Our experts said this.
Well, it's not just a question of simply who's attacked whom, although that obviously is important. It's a question of who really wields the power. And the United States, despite competition from China, is still the world's biggest economy. It's by far the world's greatest military power. And it's the direction of United States policy which determines the rest of the world's alliances and reactions to those alliances.
Well, I would say this, in a way, is a rhetorical question which answers itself. There was a time, as a matter of balance, when the narrative was that Iran was trying to export its revolution, the Khomeini revolution, but that today is not the case. What we are having today is the United States, which is quite clearly have a campaign of promotion of so-called democracy, in inverted commas, which means actually destabilizing a number of countries, carrying out regime change, invading countries, again, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, countries which were destroyed by Western, chiefly US intervention. And whereas Iran is not threatening to export its revolution at all. So once again, I must invoke the Netanyahu-Likud regime in Israel, which is obsessively trying to scapegoat Iran as responsible for the present situation. That is actually quite wrong.
Saudi Arabia, the richest country in the region, has been attacking Yemen, the poorest, for nearly a year, using weapons from the US, the UK and France. What sanctions do the public feel should be imposed on these countries?
Well, I don't think any sanctions should. I think that the U.S. has the right to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, and how those weapons are used would be a separate question. And I think, I think that would be a separate issue. And to be honest with you, I don't really know anything about that. So
there should maybe be some sanctions, maybe limiting the amount of weapons that travel out of the U.S. And maybe keeping more close tabs on who they're going to and things like that.
It's all about oil. Why do you think we're supplying them with arms? It's all about the U.S. oil companies getting access to cheap oil.
I don't really know. I don't think sanctions really work very well because they never really tend to change the minds of whoever's in charge. But I think that the U.S. specifically is really going to have to evaluate, again, their relationship with Saudi Arabia, given Saudi Arabia's actions, especially in Yemen. And I know that's not really being talked about because there's like other conflicts that are taking up space on the news. But But yeah, eventually they're going to have to come to terms with what Saudi Arabia has been doing in Yemen and whether or not we are going to take any responsibility for it or take any actions because of it.
I mean, it's the West usually imposing the sanctions, so they're not going to impose any sanctions on themselves, probably. I think maybe perhaps the best thing would be to find a way to unify the Middle East, to say you can't be doing this in our countries anymore. But obviously, there's a lot of conflicting interests within different countries, like Saudi Arabia attacking Yemen. I do think that we need to find a way for the U.S. to stop supporting like these violent regimes. And I'm not sure exactly how.
Here's the expert view on what sanctions ought to be imposed upon America, the United Kingdom and France for supplying Saudi Arabia with arms for its war in Yemen.
Well, I think we know that if this were practically any other state but Saudi Arabia, there would be international outrage, there would be calls for sanctions, there would be arms boycotts going on, because the Saudi aggression in the Yemen is unprovoked and it is leading to a humanitarian disaster. They've essentially hermetically sealed Yemen off from the outside world. It was and still is one of the poorest countries in the world, and it's getting poorer because of this war. The destruction of the infrastructure will take decades to repair. The humanitarian disaster will take decades to overcome. And the silence of the so-called international community is deafening on this question.
If it was a matter of justice, of strict justice or real equity, there should be sanctions, economic sanctions on the countries you mentioned. In reality, because the United Nations Security Council is dominated by 5 permanent members, amongst which, of course, are United Kingdom, United States and France, that is not going to happen. There will not be any sanctions. But I personally believe there should be an international tribunal based on principle of justice, which should have a moral authority to indict countries like, indeed, such Western countries, which are deliberately stirring up hatred and aiming regime change and wanting to bring about mayhem and discord in the Middle East. Quite clearly, it is the case.
Iran's missiles have no nuclear warheads, whereas Israel has over 200 of them. Given Israel has killed thousands of civilians in the last 7 years alone, what should be done to disarm Israel, especially its nuclear weapons? We asked the public for their opinion.
I think the same thing that the U.S.-Iran nuclear deal was meant to do, take all those, basically deplete their plutonium or uranium sources. I think the same thing should be done with Israel, but that figure that you gave about the number of bombs or warheads that Israel has, I mean, I think it's like estimates, because they don't confirm. They haven't told us exactly how many they have. They're just suspected, and so I think the first thing is to get them to tell us how many they have, and then basically just deplete their nuclear source, or have them ship it off to different countries like they had Iran do.
It's beyond my comprehension how to solve a problem like that.
Maybe again more moderation, just keep it more moderation on especially things that are so dangerous as nuclear weapons.
I don't know. I guess teaming up with other countries, trying to figure out the best course of action to bring about peace. I don't know, Mother Teresa was really good at bringing about peace on the individual level, so maybe there's something in that. Not really certain.
It's sad, and I hope that one day something happens, a treaty or some type of such a non-violent way that it could be resolved one day, and hopefully that's the case soon to come.
Same thing that should be done to disarm anyone who has a nuclear weapon. This world does not need nuclear weapons, no matter who it is.
I can't answer that. I mean, we got people a lot smarter than I am that spend their lives trying to figure out how you're going to have peace.
We invited our experts to consider the case to disarm Israel, the only nuclear power in the region and a country with a record of using lethal military force.
Yes, well, I mean, obviously, the first thing that should be done is for the international community to make an open and transparent declaration that they know that Israel has these weapons. It's been one of the great fictions of international relations that Israel isn't a nuclear power when everybody really knows that it is. So that would be a start in itself. It would also be a very, very good message to send that the Middle East should be a nuclear-free zone, and then there would be a levelling out, an equity in the way in which the major powers are dealing with the region. And after that, we could talk about a more comprehensive process of disarmament, because it's not just nuclear weapons, of course, that are destructive. The Saudis aren't using nuclear weapons in Yemen, but it's causing a wholesale and society-wide disaster. But the first step would be, of course, to get rid of nuclear weapons from Israel.
The United States, which are cranked up by the Zionist lobby, will not allow that to happen. However, there is a tool which we have to bring pressure to bear upon, and when I say Israel, I mean the Likud Netanyahu government, because there are lots of Israelis who actually want peace, who are moderate, want peace. But so we have a possible weapon in the sanctions, where they are in the West, there are people who are interested in campaign for peace and justice, and by targeting Israeli entities, especially involved with military efforts, one can bring some pressure to bear. The Anglican Church, the Church of England, way back, wanted to disinvest from the so-called Caterpillar program. Caterpillar was a company which provided some sort of military support to the Israeli army, which was used for repressing Palestinians or occupied territories and so on. So that would be an example of something which can be done.
The new US sanctions campaign imposed against Iran over its missile defense program attempts to remove Iran's right of self-defense. This has happened during a huge surge of Western weapons into a region already very hostile towards Iran. While Tehran does its best to coexist and cooperate with the West, it seems the West is more than happy to impose restrictions on Iran while arming the Middle East for its own interests, a strategy as immoral as it is irresponsible.